Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the virtual wSTS seminar session 2. Unfortunately, we can't do wSTS face-to-face this year, and you all know why. So we decided to do it virtually, and we want to thank you all for participating in this. This is session 2 of the virtual seminar or webinar, Timing in Finance, Electric Power, and Broadcast. My name is Pat Diamond. I'll be your moderator today. And my able co-moderator is Tommy Cook. So if you hear an accent that sounds Scottish, that's Tommy. Emailed, or a link to them will all be emailed to each and every one of the participants here. We have 2 Q&A sessions. Please, if you have a question, would you use your question box and identify to whom it's intended, and then type your question, and we'll manage it from there. We're pleased that people from around the world are participating in this. It's really cool. And I want to thank our speakers, and I also want to thank Calnex for being our sponsor. The speakers today are Victor Yadikin from FSM Labs, Sarath Madakasira, I'm sure I ruined that, Sarath, I'm sorry, Keith Manji from Microsoft, Tommy Cook from Calnex, Jeff Daigle from Pacific Northwest National Labs, Gerardo Trevino from Electric Power Research Institute, Jamie Hamarillo from ADVA, and Steve Gundart from IBM. So we've got a really, really good agenda today, and it should be very interesting. Hope everybody enjoys it. And I guess we might as well start. Victor?
Hello.
Hello, you're on.
I'm on. Okay, great. Hello. This talk, thanks for everyone for being here. This talk is called Clock Sync in the Time of COVID-19. And I just wanted to give you a kind of a tour of some clock sync issues through the viewpoint of setting up a home network. I'm, like many other people, isolating at home. And of course, my first thought once I'm working at home is to get my clock sync set up properly in my home network. And you can see our little GPS antenna sticking out the window there. Clock sync in a home network, in a home office, it actually tells you a lot about what the issues are at data centers. Just a couple of them. One is we have in my home a low-skilled workforce. In data centers, generally, you have a highly skilled but overcommitted workforce. We have a mix of commodity hardware. One of the big differences between clock sync in the enterprise and clock sync in telco, for example, we have all sorts of hodgepodge of devices. We have networking issues to solve on our packet network, and we are really interested in monitoring alerts to tell us something about the system. So just going back, so next slide, sorry. Let's see if we've got to. So many of the issues covered here are important in data centers too. In particular, there's been some recent regulatory requirements that extend clock sync requirements out to the edge, to desktop computers that people might be using, for example, brokers and other people working on financial trading. Their clocks, it seems like right now we're looking at a 50 millisecond requirement, but you have to document it. You have to be able to prove that you're keeping to it. You have to do all sorts of due diligence. That's an issue. I'm going to talk a lot in here about tools and analytical graphs that come with our Timekeeper software, but they're general issues. Next slide, please. So the core of my system at home is a cobbled together Grandmaster and a desktop. One of the most important things about it is that there are a lot of people making commodity GPS modules that combine a receiver with some kind of oscillator. In this case, it's not a really great oscillator, but it's okay. I have a very low-cost system stuck in sort of a random desktop computer. But even with that, given enough software control, I can lock down to within a few tens of nanoseconds of GPS time. This is a very jaggedy looking little graph, but if you look at the y-axis, you can see that those are 5 nanosecond bars. So a couple tens of nanoseconds, which is really all we're ever going to get out of GPS anyway. And we have all sorts of other things that we have to compensate for in the enterprise environment. Fans that turn on and off. PCIe bus is slow, unfortunately, extremely slow. We have to do interpolation to get to the clock that we want. For example, the system calls that get time. This is the key thing for our applications. Those use the internal oscillator on the CPU. And so we have to sync all of that together. So not too bad for a very low-cost system. One of the things that I want to highlight is there's my antenna. Sorry, next slide. Thank you very much. Is I just have a low-cost GPS antenna sitting out on a window ledge. We have a thing called Sky Map, which gives you a picture of what the antenna sees. And in this case, you can see I've got all the GPS satellites. I'm seeing I'm tracking their positions. I have a pretty good view in the middle, and my heat map shows me that I've got a small but okay section that I can get reception from. The purple on the right side is the roof of my house, the overhanging roof of my house. So in the data center, next slide, please. You're going to see something more complicated. You may have multiple constellations. Hopefully, you're going to have a much better view. These are two sort of random pictures from one of our customers' data centers. There you can see you have much better reception, which is what you should have if you have an antenna on the roof instead of under the roof. We have GPS versus Galileo, so we can detect. One of the big advantages of that is that we can detect whether somebody's trying to spoof or jam one of the frequencies, and that is an important issue for in the data center now. And a growing importance one is that you want to be able to fail over from one system to another. You want to be able to detect spoofing and jamming. These kinds of indicators really help you with that. The next slide, sorry, is that we want to go to is GPS versus internet. I'm in my cobbled together GM. I'm tracking multiple NTP feeds off of the internet, and I've also got my GPS. And here I'm focusing in on just one of those NTP. This is from the University of Houston. Is the dark blue. The green is my GPS, which is solid as a rock. And what you can see is that we got a pretty good frequency track of the NTP source. So normally we would be able to say this is a pretty good source. But because we have a comparison with GPS, we can see that this source is 10 milliseconds off. So the frequency is pretty solid, reasonably solid. It's coming in over the internet, but it's off by 10 milliseconds. And there is no way to find that out unless you have things to compare it to. So one of the big issues that we address in enterprise networks and finance is having multiple sources so you can do some kind of cross-checking. On the other hand, this source is pretty good in terms of frequency. It gives us essentially a very cheap way to fail over without having a high-quality oscillator in the system. We have an oscillator, but we can use this as well to keep frequency solid. So next slide, please. We have now look at multiple sources. We weren't just tracking that one internet source. I've got a bunch of internet NTP sources coming in. And the interesting thing is, a couple interesting things. One is they're all pretty much close together. So I know that I'm doing a pretty good job of tracking the ones I get. They're independent sources and they track each other. So that's a certain validation. They're all offset by about the same amount. That probably gives me an insight to my internet connection and to our network. One of the big uses and things that we didn't anticipate when we started in this is that in the enterprise, people use clock sync to diagnose network conditions. And here I can tell that there's an asymmetry on my network, probably thanks to Comcast, my provider, that gives me this 10 millisecond error. So next slide, please. We're looking at, we can use this for redundancy. As I said before, we have all these NTP sources, so we can use them to give us some redundancy in terms of frequency. But we can also do the standard thing and adjust the manually adjust the offset on one of the NTP sources. In this case, I've used the University of Houston NTP source. I bring it up so that it's tracking my GPS source more closely, and I've artistically left enough of a gap so you can see the difference between them. But what this allows me to do is I have now a failover. If something happens to my antenna, if I'm forced, if the GPS tracking doesn't work, which happens occasionally on the system because it's not a very good GPS receiver, I can still fall back and have an excellent offset. So this is one of the things when you have multiple sources and you understand what those sources are, you can do this kind of thing and move the offset up. Another view of the network, and this is a case, I'm looking at a case where the GPS failed. Another view of the network actually shows me all the sources that I'm tracking from my GM and where they're getting their sources from. So if you'll look at this, more closely, you'll see that I'm tracking multiple NTP sources over the internet. Each one of them will tell me something about where it goes to and where it's getting its information from. In an enterprise environment, of course, I wouldn't be tracking NTP over the internet, but I might be tracking multiple NTP and PTP sources from within my enterprise that are more trustworthy. And this gives me some information, and this is a great piece of debugging information. So I can see, oh look, I'm not tracking GPS anymore. Something has happened. I've also on my network, my home network, I've got a couple of different machines hooked up, and here's a desktop client that's sitting off a couple of switches away, and it's tracking 2 PTP sources from the GM and also NTP from the GM, and it's telling me its estimated offset, and you can see they're all really close. They're within a couple hundred microseconds. A couple hundred nanoseconds. The NTP is about 200 nanoseconds away from the 2 PTP sources, which are within 20 nanoseconds of each other. There's a continual incorrect folklore theory that you can't do better than milliseconds with NTP, but on a network level, the 2 protocols are pretty similar. If you have the right hardware, you can do both at about the same level. And here's my client with its 3 sources, so it's got some redundancy. Now I'm looking at, sorry, next slide, please. I'm looking at the same system, that desktop client, but now I'm looking at it from the Grandmaster. The Grandmaster is set up to track the clients and all the sources on the clients. And this is actually when I've improved the system a little bit. The graph looks very jagged, but if you're not as old as I am and you have good eyes, you can see that the y-axis is pretty small, and the difference between the peak and the valley is only about 200 nanoseconds. So those ups and downs, really, what we're seeing there are the fans turning on and off in this desktop client. So we've got really excellent timing in all 3 of those sources. They're all tracking each other. It's slightly improved from the previous slide, and the reason is because using the information I had about one-way delays and about how accurate we were, I rearranged some of the switches on my I actually have 3 different switches in my home network, which has turned out to be very useful in this period. So that's something in a real setting, in a more professional setting of a data center. People who are using this kind of information use it all the time to get an idea of what's going on in their network, what they should do, and what they should change around. Let me go back. Next slide, please, on the back porch. So my final thing is kind of showing off. This is a picture from yesterday, day before yesterday, sitting on the back porch on a Windows notebook computer using wireless. And here I'm, showing that I'm, pretty good. I have 2 sources. I'm tracking PTP and NTP because I don't care about the difference between them. And they're super tight. If you go to the next slide, you can see that there's some issues there. You can see the big gap here. And here now I'm looking at the same view, but from the monitoring that the Grandmaster is doing. The Grandmaster sees this as a jump. Well, what was this jump for? The jump was for the lid was closed and the computer shut down, and when you opened the lid, it had to catch up. That's kind of a weird issue. It's actually not an issue that's just specific to laptops, because it's an issue that we have in another guise in virtual machines. And a lot of our customers are using many virtual machines. Virtual machines will turn off. They'll be moved from machine to machine. So you have to actually have some practicality here. And you can see this rapid swerve in this picture where we catch up. And actually, there are a lot of issues that go into figuring out how to do that. You want to catch up quickly, but you don't want to introduce inconsistencies. So as the machine turns on, it might be doing some things that require to get some timestamps. You don't want to have big gaps in the timestamps. On the other hand, you don't want to be running on the incorrect time for too long. So there's a lot of engineering going on into that. And I think that's the final slide. Let's go to the next slide. So the next slide is you can contact me and ask me questions if you'd like to. Sales guys usually talk to me, so if you send an email to them, they'll be happy to connect you up. It is a sort of a global picture of the whole system. One of the big issues that we've dealt with is we want to be able to do all the different pieces. There's client software runs on the end computers. Server software distributes time. You have a compliance piece, which I haven't talked about at all, which keeps records for you. And then there's the Grandmaster, which in this case you've seen a bunch of. So all those pieces talk to each other. All of them collect data. All of them talk, are able to give you insights into how the others work. And that's the only way to really do a reliable clock sync in a network. Okay, I think that I can get off without Pat yelling at me.
Thank you very much, Victor. That was great. Now my pleasure to introduce Sarath Madakisira, and I hope I didn't say that too poorly, and Keith Mange from Microsoft. They're going to talk about recent improvements to high accuracy timekeeping in Microsoft Windows OS. Gentlemen?
Hello, my name is Keith. I'm a software developer at Microsoft working on the networking stack. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, please. We would like to start this conversation talking about time synchronization improvements in Windows Server 2019. We will also go over new PTP features and time improvements made in our yet to be announced Windows Server Next. We will talk briefly about our experience in deploying our proof of concept PTP in a data center. We will then present our latest time sync results that we have measured in Windows Server Next. Towards the end, we will touch upon a few additional details that may interest this audience, including the timestamping APIs in Windows and the Windows Insider program. Next slide, please. Windows Server 2019 was a feature-rich release from the perspective of timekeeping and synchronization. We introduced software timestamping and integrated it into our NTP client and server. This allows us to eliminate much of the jitter introduced by the networking stack. We also added UTC-compliant leap second support. We added a framework for hardware timestamping of network packets by third-party NICs. We introduced a basic BTP client that supports a limited set of PTP modes and that supports software timestamping. It performs as well as our inbox NTP client. Next slide, please. Since Server 2019, we have integrated hardware timestamping into our PTP client. For those who are not familiar with the concept, a hardware timestamp is the value of a free-running clock on the NIC that is captured when specific types of packets are transmitted or received. We worked closely with our NIC partners, prototyped with them to gain confidence in the approach, and integrated them into our stack and PTP client. The main promise of hardware timestamping is the ability to sustain time sync accuracy on a machine independent of the load on it and independent of the latency introduced by the networking stack. We also added new PTP client modes and features based on customer feedback. Most importantly, we introduced multicast and allow any PTP master modes, a combination of which enables plug-and-play PTP. This has been frequently requested, but we want to warn that your network should be secure before you use this mode in your environment. This slide also mentions the other PTP features we have added to Server Next. Next slide, please. We continue to improve on other aspects of time synchronization. For example, we noticed that time synchronization convergence was taking longer than desired when correcting for large time offsets. We optimized our clock disciplining algorithm to reduce this time to convergence. This is particularly useful at boot time. We have event logging for Windows time and PTP, and we continue to improve on this logging. While it might seem trivial, it is critical for record keeping and troubleshooting purposes, given the regulations in various sectors. Next slide, please. We deployed our PTP into a data center as a proof of concept. It was a great learning opportunity for us to understand and solve various issues. We installed on 40 machines distributed across the sprawling data center, connected by a series of interconnected switches. A GPS PTP Grandmaster was the ultimate source of time for the nodes. We found that many different switches already had good built-in PTP functionality, including the ability to run as PTP boundary clocks. This is great news for deploying PTP on existing infrastructure. With PTP and software timestamping on the Windows Server nodes, we measured time accuracies of sub 50 microseconds across all the nodes under moderate load. Next slide, please. We also learned the value of determining which PTP modes your infrastructure supports up front and ensuring that you choose a mode that is supported by all your hardware. This will save you a considerable amount of time in troubleshooting time synchronization. We also learned that existing network switches seem to have sufficiently accurate timekeeping to help realize sub 50 microsecond accuracy when the nodes are up to 3 switches apart from each other. With that, I will hand the presentation over to Sarath. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. My name is Sarath Madakasira. My areas of focus include Windows Time Service, time sync protocols, and time accuracy in Windows. I'll be talking about time sync accuracy testing in Server Next and share some of our recent results with you. I have a lot of details to cover, and I'll be moving through them fast and even attempting telling a joke at the end, and no way that's going to harden me for years to come. Right? All right. So coming to the topology here. So I just want to give you go a little bit into this topology to give you better context on the results that you're about to see in the coming slides. So we have used a very simple test topology consisting of 2 machines connected via a network switch, and the machines are generic server blades, and both machines, even the switch, both machines on the switch are a couple years old. There's nothing remarkable about them. The source of time in our test is a free-running Windows system clock on one of the machines. I know that doesn't sound very inspiring to the experts in this audience. I request you to focus on the results we realized and keep these facts in mind when analyzing them. Now, there are a few new things in this setup, of course. So we are running the Windows Server Next builds, recent Windows Server Next builds on both machines. We have a new NIC in each machine that supports hardware timestamping in Windows. These are supplied to us by independent hardware vendors, along with the corresponding drivers. Our test methodology is straightforward. We collected time sync accuracy data when running NTP with software timestamping enabled. And in a separate run, we collected time sync accuracy data while running PTP with hardware timestamping enabled, and compared the best results from the 2 sets of data side by side. The NTP scenario is our baseline. We are running Windows NTP Server on first node and Windows NTP Client on the other node. It's software timestamping enabled on both nodes. This test closely reflects the performance of PTP with software timestamping in Server 2019. The PTP scenario is what we are trying to evaluate in Server Next. We are running private PTP master on the first node and a Server Next PTP client on the other node with hardware timestamping enabled on both nodes. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the results from the baseline test using NTP and software timestamping. So Windows Time Service surfaces its internal time offset through a performance counter called computer time offset. We sampled this counter once every second and generated the scatter plot of data that you see on the left here. So a few interesting things about this chart. Please note the range here. It's 100 microseconds for the entirety of the vertical axis. Next thing to note is that it shows only absolute values and negative values are displayed as positive values. And the last thing to note is the data changes dynamically as Windows Time Service corrects the system clock. Because of this, we are mostly interested in the peaks in this chart, and you can see that it does have a few peaks in the 40+ microsecond range. The chart in the middle is a scatter plot of simple moving average of raw NTP samples. Okay, that was a mouthful. So the samples are collected once every 16 seconds, and the moving average window is less than a minute long. The vertical axis in its entirety represents offset from -100 to +100 microseconds. As you can see, the scatter plot is spread evenly around 0, and it appears nebulous at this resolution. So the chart on the right is a histogram of the data plotted in the center chart. You can see considerable amount of concentration close to 0, but most of the data is spread between -30 to +30 microseconds. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the results from testing PTP with hardware timestamping on Server Next, and it's shown in 3 charts, just like the slide before. So the chart on the left is the computer time offset performance counter data, and it shows that the time offset is considerably below 10 microseconds for the entire duration. The chart in the middle is a scatter plot of simple moving average of raw PTP time samples. The samples in this case are collected once every second, and the moving average window is a little less than a minute long. And you can see that the offsets are well within the -20 to +20 microsecond range in this chart. And the chart on the right is a histogram of the same data from the center chart, and it shows that the offset is strictly between -10 and +10 microseconds. So we deliberately use the same scale in charting the NTP and PTP data, so we can compare them side by side in the next slides. Next slide, please. So here you can see how much quieter the computer time offset performance counter is when running PTP with hardware timestamping compared to running NTP with software timestamping. Again, this was side-by-side comparisons only. They're not collected at the same time, nor are we using an accurate time source. That's always the context that helps. And we are presenting the best results we're seeing. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a scatter plot of simple moving average of raw time samples we saw in the previous slides. I would like to repeat that these are both scatter plots, even the one on the right. So I couldn't have hoped to give a better contrasting comparison between not using hardware timestamping and using hardware timestamping. And it looks like an order of magnitude improvement in time-sync accuracy with hardware timestamping. Next slide, please. So this slide repeats the 3 charts of PTP data that we saw earlier, but with more appropriate scaling, so you can see the details. The performance counter data on the left shows is a 10 microsecond vertical axis spread, and the scatter plot in the center shows a simple moving average within -10 to +10 microseconds, and it's a scatter plot. And the chart on the right is a histogram of the data from the center chart, and each bucket here represents 0.5 microsecond spread. So the charts show that the time on PTP client is within -2 to +2 microseconds for most of the time shown here. So I'm not sure about everyone here, but I believe I'm using the correct units of measurement when I say that these results are at least 1 Kessel run ahead of timekeeping in Windows from 10 years ago. And I just hope others agree with me about these units. Next slide, please. So we talked a lot about timestamping framework, and using it to synchronize time in Windows. So the logical follow-up question would be whether other applications would be able to use this functionality. So this information should be released in due time for Server Next. We can't say anything more specific at this point. Next slide, please. So this is some notes on Windows Server Next. So you can access very recent builds of Windows Server Next by signing up for Windows Insider program. Please refer to the link on this slide. Follow this link on the slide for details. Next slide, please. So this slide gives more context on the results presented here. So we have presented the best result, and I am repeating that again. And we're presenting them because they have been compelling to us, and we believe they're compelling to our customers as well. We are not making any representations about time sync accuracies in the next several release because it's still work in progress. Next slide, please. And to conclude, we are excited about the possibility of awesome time sync accuracy in Server Next, resulting from integration of PTP with hardware timestamping. We look forward to publishing detailed guidance and data for wider usage with next server release, and we are committed to making the best possible time synchronization widely available for everyone's use. And I would like to thank folks at AATS and the sponsors and the session chair for organizing this virtual conference and giving us an opportunity to make this presentation. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand back to Pat. Thank you, Pat.
So Rath and Keith, thank you very much. That was terrific. That really was good. We now have a short 10-minute period for questions, but first I'd like to echo what Sarath just said and thank Addis for their hard work in making this conference happen. They deserve to be applauded. So if you can clap quietly, please do so. I'd like to ask a couple questions. Victor, there's a question from you for you on slide 16. That's how were the estimated offsets determined?
I don't remember what is slide 16, but let me go to it. What is slide 16? It's the let's see. Oh, those estimated offsets.
Yeah.
Well, that's always sort of a sore point for any clock sync technology. I mean, you don't know if you knew what the exact time was, you wouldn't have any offset because you could adjust it. So what we're looking at here is we are following three sources. For each of them, we build a virtual clock that has a clock model of the physics of the system and the network effects. And what we're doing is seeing how closely we are able to track the updates that we're getting from our internal model of the time. So when we get an update, we compare it to the time that we forecast it would be. We throw in some fudge factors for how long we thought the packet took to arrive, and that's what we determine. And these measurements are something that we spend a lot of time tuning, and we've done a lot of testing where we test through an external source. So we do testing where we attach this kind of a system to some external source, and we compare. In fact, we've done it with the Calnex devices, so we're pretty confident that they're right. But if the questioner is skeptical of these kinds of measures, they should be, because if you haven't validated these measures, if you haven't validated the way you're doing the offsets, it's very easy to conclude that you're doing a great job when you're not. But in this case, those are pretty reliable numbers.
Okay, thank you. Sarath, what kind of oscillators are used in the NIC cards? XOs, TCXOs, OCXOs, and are there any minimal requirements that you're looking at that you hope to publish when you put out your documentation?
So we work with independent hardware vendors in making sure they can support the software functionality that we require. We have had some requirements around some basic functionality requirements. We have not really looked deeply into the oscillator requirements yet, because there is such a wide variety of and quality of cards that seem to be available. So when we do publish the final guidance, we will probably pick the best oscillators that we are seeing and then publish the exact hardware specifications and the results that we see. so people have some context. But please keep in mind that there will be a variety of vendors that will be available who would support this functionality in Windows.
Okay, great.
I'm not sure if that.
Good, thank you. One question is, what was the PTP message rate that you guys were using?
Could I just, Pat, if you don't mind, can I just interject there?
Please do.
We're one of the independent software vendors who are supporting that Microsoft API, and Timekeeper does support it. We get nanosecond levels of accuracy from it. It's a really great improvement in Windows, and I think it's going to really change the game for a lot of people. So
cool.
That's what I wanted to mention.
So I hope Microsoft writes down that you gave them a plug. That's good.
We'll send them a bill.
Well, thank you very much. That's very interesting. Another question about hardware timestamping in virtual machines. How does the hardware timestamping work with a virtual machine? Either Keith or Sarath, whichever of you want to answer.
Sarath, I can answer.
I think okay, go ahead.
Yeah, we don't pass the timestamps through to the virtual machines. There's some issues with the different partitions being able to interpret a clock in a different physical machine. So we're still working on it, but for now we're suggesting that people synchronize their host and that they use what we call the time synchronization service to synchronize their guests with their hosts. But there could be a better story in the future, let's hope.
Okay, that's a good answer. There's a couple questions relative to how would somebody know which NICs are designed or optimized for your server 2019? Are you going to publish that information, or how would one go about doing it?
We are working on a certification for the NICs. That certification will be available in the next server release. So it'll be one of the qualifications for a NIC, and it'll be clear which ones support it.
Okay. Another question is the nanosecond scale accuracies only for the server Next product? What about for other Windows platforms?
So the time synchronization components are present in almost all Windows SKUs. So you may see Windows Client or maybe even a Windows IoT platform. Maybe some of the functionality, the complete set of functionality may not be available, like logging in, event logging and things like that.
Okay.
But these are generally available on all Windows SKUs, and you should be able to configure any SKU to get the highest accuracy possible on that SKU. But again, the hardware limits what we can do, so the results vary by platform and hardware.
Okay, thank you, Sarath. Here's a question specifically for Keith. It's how are the hosts synchronized, and what is the source?
Yeah, I'm assuming that's in reference to my statement about virtual machines.
That's all I have in the question, so I guess that's a fair assumption.
The host can synchronize via NTP or PTP, and those can use software or hardware timestamps. So the host synchronizes to the outside world with NTP or PTP, and then the guests use the VMs use this other time sync mechanism we have to get the time extended to those guests. I hope I answered that question completely.
Well, you certainly answered it. Another one is, what is a nanosecond scale supported on specific CPUs? Like
Can I, Pat, if I could do one more thing, just for people who are interested in that, the original WSTS program, vWSTS program, had this talk from Microsoft followed by a talk from one of our engineers about all the measurements we did with the same API on Windows. And if people are interested in that, I can make that available as well. And it does show you which different pieces of hardware work best with the new API.
Okay, that's cool. back to the question that I'd asked before, what is the nanosecond scale that you're using for the processor, whether it's AMD x86 or whatever?
I assume that's questions for us.
Yeah.
So we are, I mean, right now we are not claiming nanosecond accuracy. We have only seen microsecond accuracy. So these are generic processors. I mean, I believe one of them is an AMD and one of them is an Intel. It's not even, I mean, I just found 2 servers. We all know why, right? So I just found the hardware that I could find and then try to run this test on that and see what I got, what the results I got. So again, when we publish our best results, we are going to try to set up a well-known or a really good environment and then try to get the best results possible. But right now, it's just generic hardware that we know that was available at the moment. So
okay, that's good. One question that I don't think was answered, or I didn't ask it properly. What is the PTP message rate you guys were using, or did you vary it?
I believe the message rate was from the default profile, once a second. It was, or maybe once every 2 seconds. It was not. I'm sorry. I think it was once a second. We did not run too many variations on that. And again, we have presented our best results. I think that should be taken as a qualifier, because this is not the ideal environment for testing accuracy that we had. There are all kinds of things in the environment that interfere with the accuracy testing. We have debuggers. I mean, this is a functional test environment, not a production environment. So, these are the results that we could gather at the moment. It's not comprehensive by any means.
Got to start somewhere, right? One other question we have is, was the network under load or was it in a quiesced state when you were testing?
Again, I don't think there was any network load, so it was in a quiescent state. So the hardware timestamping has been a promise that we are yet to realize. We have to look at how performance would be under different kinds of network load. We know that having extremely high network traffic can interfere with some of the timing. So we'll have to see. Okay, good.
Well, thank you guys. Got some good questions, some good answers, and now it's time to move on to the next piece of the agenda. And what I'd like to do now is introduce Tommy Cook from Calnex. And Tommy's going to give us some insights into Calnex services and products. Tommy, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much, Pat. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's inspiring to see so many people taking the time to join the webinar today. And so it's a great pleasure for Calnex to be able to sponsor this event. Next slide, please. I'm not going to take much of your time today, but I wanted to introduce Calnex if you're not familiar with us. Next slide, please. Calnex is a test and measurement company based in the UK. To be more precise, we're actually based in Scotland, just outside Edinburgh. So what is Scotland famous for? Well, we have a few iconic items like the kilts and the tartan and the bagpipes. Next slide, please. We also have some strange food stuff called haggis, and we claim the ownership of Gulf. And maybe more importantly, and in my humble opinion, we produce the finest Scotch whisky in the world. So Scotland is a country with a rich cultural history with lots to talk about, all of which, unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about today. Instead, I'm just going to tell you about Calnex. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we are a test and measurement company that primarily focuses on solutions for design conformance and the verification phases of equipment under development. We also have solutions to aid engineers addressing complex maintenance issues post-deployment. Next slide, please. In the design conformance arena, the topic generating a lot of interest and activity at the moment is the conformance to Class C and D equipment requirements for PTP clocks designed to conform to G8273.2. Now, these are tough requirements for designers of network equipment, and especially to meet Class D, where the demands a combined time error of less than 5 nanoseconds. Next slide, please. That really is a tough ask for equipment, and to prove conformance, test equipment with sub-nanosecond accuracy is essential, and today we have such an animal in our portfolio. This is a time of unprecedented architectural changes in networks, and it is not only the new standards that are creating new test challenges. Next slide, please. If you attended the conference last week, you would have heard about this disaggregation, where white box hardware platforms from one vendor have software-based virtual machines installed from another vendor. Along with the advantages this concept offers to people building networks, it also introduces new challenges around testing the combination of a platform from one source and a virtual machine from another source. Next slide, please. So if this is the challenge that you're facing, we should chat, because we can provide you advice and insight into the best way to approach these challenges. Next slide, please. And if new standards and new ways to build networks is not enough of a challenge for the industry, the 5G vision needs to implement network slicing to split the capacity to deliver different types of services. If this is a challenge you have, we can help. Next slide, please. Therefore, if your challenge is proving conformance to Class C or D standards, or if you're managing integration of disaggregated solutions, or if network slicing is keeping you awake at night, next slide, please. Or even better, if you just want to discuss the joys of Scotch whisky, give me a call. It's good to talk. Enjoy the rest of the webinar. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, Tommy. Any questions for Tommy will be included in the final question session. So as we're moving along pretty quickly, it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Daigle from Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, who's going to talk about electric power applications of wide area time synchronization measurements. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Pat, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. I'm an electrical engineer, 31 years at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, operated by Battelle for the U.S. Department of Energy, located in Washington State. Next slide. So what I'd like to do is talk about timing and timing requirements in the electric power sector, and really focused on high precision type timing of the type that you would get from GNSS or satellite-based timing signal. Not quite at the sub-nanosecond level, as you'll see in a minute, but things that are more rigorous than what you would get from something like NTP or WWB. The key takeaway that I'd like to leave with you, and we'll talk about spoofing and jamming and things that could happen to measurements here in a minute, but really the electric power system itself will continue to operate. My judgment is that it'll continue to operate with timing disrupted because the function and control of the power system doesn't necessarily directly rely on that timing source. So the grid will continue to operate at 60 hertz in North America or 50 hertz in Europe and elsewhere without access to this precise timing. The timing is used for measurement applications that I'll get into in more detail to enhance wide area situational awareness and visibility and controls. But the type of controls that are employed are still nascent at this time and coming on with new applications. If we do lose that time synchronization, of course, the devices that are installed to make use of it have internal oscillators, and they can, assuming it's not spoofed, they can hold time with reasonable accuracy. Of course, the better the oscillator, the better that holdover is. But why this is important to us in the electric power area is that we see more and more utilities using this type of timing in a more widespread area. So we have to really get ahead of it. So slide 58, please. So the main applications that I will focus on is synchrophasers, and that's the third one on the table here. And you can see that it's roughly microsecond accuracy, so that's the type of thing that was really enabled by the advent of GPS and low-cost, ubiquitous time that can be synchronized across the wide area. There are more low-tech things related to things that might be second accuracy in terms of some of the control room applications, millisecond accuracy that might be required for event recording and sequence of events and things like that. And I included advanced protection on here of traveling wave fault location. This is a high-tech means of doing fast detection of faults and clearing of faults on transmission infrastructure. And that requires measuring the traveling wave that arrives at one end of the transmission line and comparing it with the wave that might be occurring at the other substation at the other end of the transmission line, and then communicating between those substations and comparing the time that traveling wave arrives. And if you think about the speed of light, and the traveling wave is occurring at the speed of light, and about 1 nanosecond is a foot of travel of the speed of light, then 100 nanoseconds would be able to isolate a fault within 100 feet. And that's good enough for any sort of protection application. So, but there are vendors that have that capability to do traveling wave fault location, and they require that level of precision to be able to operate. Next slide, please. So on the event recording and the disturbance monitoring, there is a regulatory requirement in North America that devices that do the disturbance monitoring must be synchronized within 2 milliseconds of UTC. And so this is a regulatory requirement that utilities must follow. Next slide. But I want to talk about synchrophasers. That's the main focus of my presentation. So to do that, I'll orient you. So if you have a waveform here, so in North America, this would be a 60 hertz waveform, and you can measure the offset of that waveform, then that's a phase angle that you're actually measuring on that waveform. Next slide. And the key is if you do that across a wide area, so those substations might be hundreds of miles or very large distance apart from each other. If you have a wide area time synchronization, you can actually measure the phase angle difference between them. So it's really time synchronization here is the key. In this application, it doesn't, if both substations have the same offset, you still have the same measurement. So they may not need to line up with some sort of regulatory time signal. It's really the time synchronization that's key. And again, that's really what we're focused on. Next slide. So there's a technology that's been around for a few decades called a phaser measurement unit. And it was really enabled by the advent of things like GPS that gave you low cost accuracy that would be able to make that measurement. So if you go to the next slide. So why I started this off saying that microsecond accuracy is what you're looking for. You know, we like to make these measurements. There's a IEEE standard that talks about a 1 degree total vector error measurement. And so really to get in the right ballpark, you would want to be measuring these within a 1 degree of phase angle or better. And at 60 hertz, that corresponds to 46 microseconds. So clearly a GPS clock is well within the range of being able to do this type of measurement. Next slide, please. And of course, what you do with the measurement matters. And there are different types of phaser measurement units. And so the IEEE standards define 2 different types of PMUs. There's a protection class and a measurement class. And the main difference between them is filtering, because if you're using a high-speed application where you are doing dynamic control or things like that, you want the signal to track the transients better. Make sure that you have aliasing protection and things like that. Then you might want to have higher filtering, but then that would be a lower sampling rate of the measurement application. So those are both defined by IEEE standards. Next slide. So the synchrophasers kind of fit this niche between the lower speed thing that, you know, we have something called SCADA, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. It's been around for a long time, and that's the command and control infrastructure that provides the telemetry to control room operators in the control center and gives them the ability to control switches and generators and things like that out on the grid. And then you have your higher speed protective relays and digital fault recorders and things that are capturing the waveforms of your faults. And in between there, you have these devices called phasor measurement units providing synchrophasor data. And again, it's all enabled by that wide area time synchronization in the microsecond class of accuracy. And next slide. And just having high-speed measurements. So in this particular case, there was a research-grade devices that were deployed in the Western power grid back in the 1990s. And there was a blackout that occurred on August 10th, 1996. And the plot on the left is showing, it's about 10 minutes of data across there. And zoomed in there on the, when you have that growing oscillation, the period of that oscillation is 0.3 hertz. And so clearly that's bad to have that growing oscillation. That is not good for a power grid to have that happening. And the engineers, you know, knew about these oscillations, and they have computer models to predict and understand these oscillations so they can take action to avoid them from occurring. The root cause of the August 10th blackout was that blue line down below the red line. The red is measured data. The blue is what the computer model predicted should have happened. So clearly there's a problem. But measuring a 0.3 hertz oscillation requires something that happens faster than your SCADA measurements. If you go to the next slide, should be slide 61, or excuse me, 67. If you have your SCADAs gathering data every 4 seconds, those are the big black dots, you can't see oscillations like that. And so this is an example of a oscillation you might want to measure. And so the smaller black dots are gathering data at 30 times per second. That's typical data rate for your phasor measurement units. And so clearly, you know, you need that high speed data to be able to see these types of oscillations. If you go to the next slide, slide 68, there's a number of applications that we have for these phasor measurement units, including the model validation that I was just talking about, and event analysis and things like that. But on the right side, you see that there's some control applications. Now, this is where you start to worry about the robustness and accuracy of that data and the security of that data. And so things like jamming and spoofing and things start to enter your mind when you get into these control applications. If you go to the next slide, in North America, we have something called the North American Synchrophasor Initiative on slide 69. And this is a joint effort between DOE and EPRI and industry to really look at these applications of these synchrophasors, promote the value of this, have a forum for sharing best practices and lessons learned. We started this in 2006. And one of the metrics that we had in the early days was how many utilities are actually making use of this type of data. And so we you know, put the little blue dots on the map of this is where we have a phasor measurement unit installed in substation where they're networked and streaming the data out to support some higher level application. And in 10 years, you know, you can see a dramatic increase. And I'm not going to do these maps anymore just because it's to the point where you just paint the map blue and because so many people are using these measurement devices for lots of different applications, a lot of different vendors supporting the utility industry. And again, this is worldwide. And so we have international participation in NASP meetings and synchrophasor topics come up in other electric power forums like IEEE and SIGRE and other organizations as well. So it's really becoming mainstream. So if you go to the next slide, we have the way we operate is we have 5 task teams in our NASP community with 2 work group meetings a year. Unfortunately, our meeting that was scheduled for last month was converted to webinar, which is similar to what we're doing today. And our upcoming meeting is scheduled for Minneapolis. So we've got our fingers crossed that we can actually do that face-to-face. But again, things are uncertain. But we have substituted with some monthly webinars. So if you go to the next slide, with my closing minutes, what I'd like to do is talk about some results of some spoofing tests that we did a few years ago. This is in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Texas, Austin and Northrop Grumman. And if you go to the next slide, what we wanted to do is have a test of how well the GPS receivers could stand up to spoofing. This was a few years ago, so there are newer technologies that provide some protection against this that wasn't available back then. If you go to the next slide, we did make sure that we were constrained from actually broadcasting spoof signals into the environment. Next slide. And the main difference of the test was how fast we could bring the phase angle difference from the reference based on the spoof signal. All 3 clocks that we tested were susceptible to this. The difference was the rate at which we can change it based on how good the internal error checking algorithm was. Next slide. But all had different behavior when we turned off the spoofing signal. So some reacquired the signal without setting an error flag. Some set an error flag while the spoofing signal was turned off and things like that. So, you know, we did see some need to have a stronger standards about how to deal with that situation. If you go to the next slide, jamming is also an issue, but I'm less concerned about jamming. There is error detection and things that would kick in. And if you go to the next slide, should be slide 77. We believe that if you are using this measurement technology for important applications, you definitely want to think about your dependence on satellite receivers, unless they're spoof-proof. Next slide. This is where we're going with NASP. One of the things that we're thinking about is even higher speed measurements to get into characterizing inverter-based resources and generation sources and things like that. Next slide. We have a white paper on that topic that's available on our website. And if we roll to the conclusion slide, I'd like to just thank you again for listening to me, and I will be available during the Q&A to answer questions. Pat, back to you.
Jeff, thank you. That was terrific. That's, you know, when you plug your toaster in, you don't think of all this stuff that's actually happening in the background. So it's really, really nice to know that. So thank you very much. That was quite informative. It's my pleasure now to introduce Gerardo Trevino, who is from the Electric Power Institute, and he's going to talk to us about resilient time synchronization in the energy sector, evaluation of mitigation technologies. Gerardo, it's yours.
Hi, thank you for the invitation again to the group, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So again, my role in EPRI, I'm a technical leader in cybersecurity, and today I'll be talking to you about the projects that we're conducting in this area. So please, next slide. So the general agenda for the presentation is going to be very quickly. We're going to cover background information on general motivations for our projects and our research. I will then go over a survey conducted by EPRI in relation to precision timing in the energy sector, and we'll also talk about, again, more detail about supplemental projects and our ongoing resilient time synchronization for the energy sector interest group, which is something that we launched this year, although we were also impacted by this events. And finally, I'll talk to you about some of the next steps and so on. So please, next slide. So again, our premises or a high-level hypothesis for our research, it starts with the fact that GPS is vulnerable, as mentioned by Jeff and others. Therefore, since we in the sector use GPS, we are therefore vulnerable. The Department of Homeland Security divides, again, just for information, the energy infrastructure into 3 interrelated segments, which include the electricity, oil, and natural gas. EPRI conducts applied research mainly for the electricity segment, although I did want to point out that our members also own gas and other energy-related infrastructure. So I guess the general question is, again, why is time synchronization important to utilities? So next slide, please. And the reason that I see, again, is the electricity segment is moving towards faster response times. And really, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that utilities are moving towards technology that will more heavily rely on precision timing, that's for sure. And mainly what this slide shows, what I would like to get across is that some of these applications that we found today are also going to transition into other technologies. So one point is, again, new technologies are going to continue to be implemented out there. And number 2, there will be the need to understand what is the risk associated with timing vulnerabilities, including the ones mentioned by our previous speakers. We also see these new technologies, so to speak, including mitigation technologies. So our research is focused on testing these mitigations to try to understand and effectively measure how effective these technologies are to reducing risk. Please, next slide. So EPRI conducted a survey a while back, and this is just to present to you a general sense of what we're talking about here. So in this specific graphic, we're talking about some of the timing requirements in the segment, which again are all moving to the left side of the screen, meaning that they're moving towards more of the microsecond type of area. So Jeff talked about synchrophaser. Definitely, that's a segment that is pushing this. Also, protective relays and other technologies like the traveling wave technologies, which require heavily on time synchronization. Please, next slide. This slide shows some of the additional assets that are planned for the connection to precision time in the next 5 years. Again, just a different way of looking at this. We're looking at what are the overall systems that depend on this time synchronization data. Please, next slide. This slide shows the time distribution protocols. Overall, we see IRV being heavily used in the industry, and we continue to see an increase in IEEE power profile 1588, along with other protocols being introduced in new substation design. So I think this graph is going to continue to look different as we get these systems deployed in new substation designs. Please, next slide. So in our research, we asked the question to our group back in 2018. This is a group mainly of cybersecurity people within the industry, and the question is, assuming a GPS cyber attack will have an impact, which area will be most important to understand? And our members indicated that obviously transmission has a higher impact. I do want to mention, though, that the notion that GPS will not negatively impact the operation of the transmission network is proven to be true. For those of you that follow the GPS event, there was a recent event that was identified May 15, 2014, and you can look it up. What happened is many of the GPS users reported in some GPS outages in some of the devices, and there was essentially, long story short, it was linked to a problem into the satellite data sent within the satellites and how this data gets interpreted by the receivers. So we saw, for instance, two 500 kV lines that essentially went down due to this error. So what this error caused again is, I would say, the largest transmission lines to be impacted by a let's say a non-malicious error. So again, these errors have the potential for significant impact in the operations of the grid. So next slide, please. So again, some of the industry trends based on the surveys, again, we see over the next 5 years a significant increase in the introduction of PTP into the substation and different operations. We also see that utilities will be moving away from SONET type technologies and incorporating packet-based technologies. And many utilities, again, plan to increase the use of precision time over the next 5 years for synchrophase measurement, network routers, network switches, asset health monitors, inverters, and security systems. So this is the overall message from here. So what are we doing in EPRI about this is what I want to discuss next. So please, next slide. So we've been conducting, I would say, a project since, I would say, 2015. The initial task of this was to evaluate GPS receivers. We subsequently moved to identify, based on some of the data that you're seeing here, what are the most, I would say, vulnerable applications that we can look at and monitor and test. We have completed that project. We have released a publication for this phase one, what we call phase one, in December of this last year. And our members have now funded a second phase to this project, which is kind of running since 2019, but is going to run until next year and probably after that. Again, the main core ask of this project is to understand these mitigation technologies that we discussed and how are they going to be able to reduce the risk. But what we recognize is that there's a need to engage with the vendor community and also other stakeholders. So EPRI developed what we call the EPRI Resilient Time Synchronization Interest Group, which is a mechanism that is internally funded by EPRI to allow us to really get to understand the technologies that are coming into the market and trying to incorporate their test plans into our test plans, and to the best that we can evaluate these different technologies. We really see a whole plethora of systems, including antenna systems, bump in the wire systems, anomaly detection systems that we wanted to test. So some of the milestones that we're looking to produce will be a set of industry best practices coming out later this year. And we're going to have also a report coming out at the end of next year. So please, next slide. This is some specific information about the projects. You can find it online. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer any of those. Please, next slide. This is the report. Some of the findings here is that future systems that rely on time synchronization must be evaluated against attack vectors before deployment. This evaluation can occur in parallel to performance testing. This report is limited to project funders on that project, and that's the information on the report. Please, next. So again, the phase two project approach has mainly 6 tasks, but ultimately what we're trying to do here in the second phase is to generate a vulnerability test definition, to go through some of these mitigations, and we are also looking at the possibility on running some tests in parallel as we find these technologies may be kind of grouped in some clumps of technologies. Again, we will then produce a report on our findings. Please, next. A more precise information on the resilient time synchronization for the energy sector interest group. Again, this is a group that has the objective to, again, share experiences, talk about the tools and techniques that are needed to provide this mitigation on these vulnerabilities. And we ask for anyone who works within the position, navigation, timing areas to participate. This includes utility vendors, government, and other industry groups. What we're doing right now is we're conducting meetings with vendors and other stakeholders, and we have conducted several dialogues. We will then move to more precise activities to move into the development of a test procedure and subsequent test setup and ultimately testing for next year. So this interest group, I guess the message is that it's related to the projects, to the project that we're working on. Another point that I want to say is in my research, I noticed that even within the utility, you will have groups of experts. So you may not find, let's say, necessarily an expert on one thing. It may not be clear, but the utilities also have telecommunication networks that they own. So really what we look to have in this interest group and what we've accomplished is to put together a group of people who span across cybersecurity, telecommunication, relay protection, and other areas to come up with some of these important, I will say, test analysis. Some of the direction, again, in a more graphical way from this phase 2, again, is looking at the GPS mitigation evaluation, and the technologies that you see here are the ones that we're focusing on. But there's also, you know, a focus on what is the, let's say, substation architecture design that we want to produce. So there's some discussions on creating reference architecture that incorporates some of these into, let's say, a template for utilities to review in future deployments. So again, just a general overview on what we're focusing on this project and what is the overall direction of the research. So please next. So the next steps is, again, we intend to evaluate mitigation technology. So if you have a technology that supports I will say, the reduction of risk from GPS or other timing vulnerabilities, we'll be happy to talk to you and try to understand how to put something together on that end. We also intend to, again, evaluate applications that may be impacted by these timing errors, and we plan to do this, I will say, this year and next year. So thank you for your time, and I think that's the end of my presentation.
Gerardo, thank you very much. That's very interesting. It really informative. There's information there that I think is going to bring some very interesting conclusions, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you in the future about how your evaluations are going. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jamie Jaramillo from Oscilloquartz ADVA. Jamie is going to talk about IP broadcast timing requirements and possible solutions. Go for it, Jamie.
All right, thank you very much, Pat. I hope you can hear me okay. Yes?
You sound great.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to talk about timing solutions for IP broadcast. Gonna go over some of the migration that's happening in the industry and some innovative solutions that are available to ensure that your IP broadcast services can be transmitted with the appropriate quality over IP transport. So the next slide, if you can move the next slide, please. It's just a one more, please. Just a slide that goes over where the IP timing standard fits within the overall SMPTE IP broadcast, let's call it umbrella of standards. So for audio and video applications, SMPTE 2059 is the standard that is mostly used. It encompasses both audio and video applications, and it's one of the subsections within the SMPTE 2110 protocol for standards for audio and video or professional audio and video applications. There's also an additional standard by the name of AES 67 that's particularly designed for audio applications. I'm not going to go over that in this presentation, but that is something to be aware of. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to provide information on that as well. Next slide, please. This slide is mostly informational for those of you that are new to this protocol, but it gives some interesting information on SMPTE 2059 and how the PTP profile works. Domain number information here is interesting. The announced interval of the PTP packets and sync interval of the sync interval packets are mentioned here. And one of the things that I think is interesting to take away from this is that accuracy for broadcast applications is not the main concern in comparison to telecom and maybe power utilities applications, but really the fact that the different streams are aligned as they are packetized and depacketized over the network. So these are some of the packet rates that are defined by the protocol, but ultimately the applications and the application vendors and manufacturers are the ones that define really what timing accuracy is required depending on the application implemented. Next slide, please. So this is an overall view of what's happening in the industry. Traditionally, the broadcast industry works with a protocol by the name of SDI. It is a digital protocol for audio and video, or broadcast quality audio and video. But now with the advent of IP networks, that technology can be now packetized, converted to IP, and IP transport technology can be used for distribution of broadcast signals to the end users or to consumers. So this advent of using IP transport for broadcasting signals is something that's causing a lot of interest because there's a huge savings for broadcasters to use IP-based transport instead of the traditional satellite transport technology. The cost reduction is significant, so there is a lot of interest in this migration and converting SDI and SDI-based content to IP for use of IP transport. But of course, as you convert SDI to IP, you then have to convert it back to SDI for consumption. And this is where encoders and decoders come into play, and timing is a key factor for these elements. All packets have to align when they are converted to IP so that the decoder, when it receives these packets, can reconstruct the audio and video correctly and display it appropriately to those that consume the content. Next slide, please. So these next couple of slides, as we can move to the next one, we'll talk a little bit about how the concept of video over IP is evolving today and some of the benefits of this evolution, right? We'll go over that. On the left-hand side, you'll see a traditional broadcast network with SDI signals. All the elements that create the SDI signal do have to have a sync source so that audio and video can align when edited and produced and transmitted to end users, right? So this is already used in the SDI world today. There are clocks that are called master sync generators that provide a signal to all the devices that are creating the content. These today are physical connections and create a lot of limitation as far as where the content can be produced, because all the devices that are creating this content have to have a unique source, and the connection back to the source is physical. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see how the packet network is now making the production of content much more flexible. Using the packet network, the devices that create the content can be distributed through a LAN or a very high quality WAN in some cases. And the timing for all these devices can now be provided using PTP broadcast profile, which is the other name for it is SMPTE 2059, as I mentioned before. So this allows a lot more flexibility for the creation and transmission of the content, but timing is critical so that all the content that is packetized can be recovered and delivered to the consumer with the correct amount of quality of service. Next slide, please. So of all the slides in the presentation, this is probably the most important one, and the one to really keep in mind when thinking about implementing IP broadcast and how timing needs to be deployed to support this new technology. As you can see, it's a similar concept to one of the previous slides, where you have video content going into a encoder, but along with this video, you have to make sure you're providing audio, which could be from multiple sources. For example, at a sporting event, there's many microphones all over the stadium or arena that catch the audio, and they have to synchronize it with the video. And then there's metadata that goes along with this. Things like graphics or closed captioning, multiple languages. This metadata information, when it gets packetized, has to align with the audio and the video. So as you can see, the size of the different packets are different, or the different types of content streams. So the devices, the encoders and decoders, have to make sure that the timestamping for every single packet aligns, and the decoder has to do the same to recreate the content on the reception side, so that there's enough quality to the audio and the video and the metadata, so that everything syncs up and everything makes sense when consumed by the end user. So if we think about the previous slide, you need to have both of these elements have a similar time reference so that all the packets can line up. When you have a geographically dispersed transmission or distribution network, this is impossible. So in this case, what we use is a master clock that has reference to GPS, right? That is stratum 1. So this is the most important takeaway from the presentation, is that both on the encoding and the decoding side, these devices have to have a stratum 1 reference to an IEEE 1588 Grandmaster clock with SMPTE 2059 protocol, so that you can ensure that your encoding and decoding all lines up and the content is suitable for consumption. In the broadcast industry, this concept is called lip sync. Next slide, please. This is just another reference slide, which I think is very interesting. I spoke about metadata in the previous slide. HDR is a type of metadata that is transmitted with the video signal that enhances the picture quality. This HDR information is packetized as well now, and so the HDR information has to line up with the video so that the enhanced quality of the images transmitted over the IP connection is recovered correctly and applied correctly. So it just gives you here on the right-hand side where the screen is, gives you an example of what the difference is when you implement HDR or not. So it's another stream of metadata that needs to be aligned with the audio and the video so that everything is lined up and the reconstruction of the signal comes out with the right amount of quality. Next slide, please. One of the remaining concepts here is IP workflows, and IP workflows is basically your ecosystem of equipment that a broadcaster has to use to create, to edit and produce content now can all be done over IP. This gives a lot of flexibility to where the different people that perform these different tasks are located, and you can be more efficient by using IP connections to accomplish these different tasks. Before, all these different activities and people that perform the activities had to be in the same location because the connections between the devices creating the content and the production of the content had to be done using SDI, which needed a physical connection, and the timing signal had to be a physical connection to each device. Now, when using IP, you can disaggregate all these functions and become more efficient. So in the past, where maybe a stadium event, you had to have multiple people installing cameras, controlling cameras and microphones and editing equipment. Now you can have a centralized location that's connected by IP for all the editing, mixing, graphics, etc., and very few personnel out in the field that are deploying the IP cameras and microphones to capture the content. So IP workflows are critical, and here you can see how PTP or SMPTE 2059 is critical to each stream so that when the production team has to work on the content, everything lines up and it is transmitted appropriately out to consumers. Next slide, please. This is a slide that illustrates the importance of having the frames in a video stream align, right? Both in time, but also in order. So if your audio and video capture equipment doesn't have a appropriate time reference or synchronization reference as where the content is recovered and reproduced, frames can be out of time, but more importantly, they can be out of order as well, since everything is packetized now and the packets can traverse different paths within a network, right? So left-hand side shows you what happens when timing is off. On the right-hand side, if you have the same reference for both the creation or the encoding of the content and the decoding, then everything will line up, everything will be not only at the right sequence and time as far as the reception of the content is concerned, but also in order. Next slide, please. This is just a quick representation on how different elements need to synchronize to each other. On the left-hand side is frequency signals between elements and how they can be off. This is called jitter. And on the right-hand side, it's an example of buffer capabilities and how a buffer can underrun or overflow if it's not synchronized appropriately to other data equipment in the network. Next slide, please. This slide is just an example of what happens to clocks in two different devices if they're not synchronized. This is an example of packet delay variation. So if our clocks on the transmit side and on the receiving side are not lined up, then obviously the processing of the data will have issues. Next slide, please. I think we're getting to the end here because I'm basically out of time. Actually, we'll skip the slide. If you can move to the next slide, please. So this is I'll use this as the last slide. There are some unique timing sources that are available now. One of the most interesting ones is a Grandmaster clock on an SFP. Very interesting form factor for broadcast applications. It can be installed in locations such as trucks or mobile units that don't have a lot of space, and provide SMPTE 2059 timing reference to broadcast applications. So I'll use this as my last slide. If you skip over the last 2 slides, please, we should be at the end. So sorry I ran a little bit over. I won't go into all the details of the summary, but if you have any questions on timing for broadcast applications or any of the details of SMPTE 2059 or AES 67, I'd be happy to answer questions. Thanks a lot, Pat. Sorry for running over.
That's all right. Thank you. Very interesting. It's very incredibly sophisticated. And now I would like very much to introduce Steve Gunnert from IBM. Steve's going to talk about updating us on enterprise computing time synchronization. Steve.
Thanks, Pat, and thank you, Addis, for giving me the opportunity to speak today, and thank you to everybody that's out there on the webinar. My name is Steve Gunnert. I am the IBM Z timing architect. The IBM Z is the IBM mainframe, and today I'm going to talk about what we're doing with the mainframe and time synchronization. Next slide, please. The abstract is kind of a summary of what we're going to talk about and just a little bit of background on the mainframe. But the latest generation of the IBM Z Systems family of mainframes is used by over 90% of the largest 100 global banks in the world as the computing platform that they run their business on. It's also used heavily outside of finance in insurance, retail companies worldwide, travel as well. But it's often said in the media the world's economy runs on the IBM mainframe. So what I'm going to talk about is the time synchronization regulatory changes that we've seen. I'll summarize those that led to IBM studying PTP for the mainframe and what we're doing with PTP on the platform. And then I'll also discuss a couple slides at the end because resiliency and security is so important to our mainframe customers. We'll talk about some of our thoughts on resiliency with the time synchronization networks. Next slide, please. So the agenda just broken down into a few different topics here that we'll touch on each of these with a couple of slides briefly. Next slide, please. Okay. So a little bit of a summary on the recent regulatory changes, specifically in the finance industry. The background with these. Over the last several years, we've seen further and further proliferation and usage of electronic trading platforms, along with a lot of automation going along with increasing frequency being used, the high frequency trading systems, or HFT. This has led to governments to increase the synchronization regulations or the accuracy required in these regulations, as well as establishing regulations for traceability to a common reference time scale. And it's also important to note that these regulations that we'll be touching on, all the systems involved in these systems for trading, all the systems are subject to the new rules. Next slide, please. So in the US, FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, is the agency that we'll focus on here. And they've had a series of rules over the last decade, but the most recent changes, which went into effect in 2018, require synchronization to within 50 milliseconds of the NIST UTC clock. This also requires the capability for an audit log for the members or the financial institutions to prove compliance with the regulation. And this is done through what is known as the Consolidated Audit Trail. The CAT is the acronym. The CAT requires sending of complete documentation on all orders to a central repository by 8 a.m. Eastern time the day following a trade. And the timestamps have to be at millisecond resolution, and there's 5 places in the audit trail that are looked at for these trades. Next slide, please. Now, just recently, a couple of months ago, FINRA published this notice that you see here, CAT Alert 2020-02, and this is on the standards for self-reporting deviations of clock synchronization. I wanted to talk about this today. It's very important if you're subject to these regulations to become familiar with this. This notice was a 4 to 5 page notice. It just amplifies the audit rules and the requirements and when you have to self-report. But this is important because we were made aware by some of our financial clients just recently that this is starting to be enforced this summer, that they've been given some deadlines on when they need to meet this. So this, I think we're going to start to see these financial regulations, at least here in the US, become more heavily enforced than they have been since they came out. They seem to have been given a little bit of a grandfather period to implement the changes that they needed. Next slide. Now, the European Union has their own sets of regulations that are very similar to what FINRA has. That's through ESMA and the MiFID II directives. These requirements also went into effect in 2018. They also apply to any organization dealing in the European financial instruments in those markets. So not specifically limited to European institutions, but any company or organization that is playing in these markets. The MiFID II requirements are much more stringent than the US requirements that we just talked about. Okay. The business clocks that are involved have to provide a timestamp for any reportable event coordinated to UTC. They have to use a link to one of the laboratories maintaining what's known as a UTC-K realization of UTC, or they can be to the time signals disseminated by GPS or another satellite system. The level of accuracy that we see cited in these regulations is 100 microseconds divergence from UTC, and the granularity needs to be for the timestamps at 1 microsecond or better. So much more stringent in Europe than the US. Next slide, please. So for the, excuse me, the IBM mainframe, since 2006 and continuing through today, we have a proprietary time protocol known as Server Time Protocol, or STP. And STP is designed to provide the capability for a cluster of mainframes. We know this as a, we call a parallel sysplex. It's up to 31 of the mainframes clustered together to maintain time synchronization with each other and form what we call a coordinated timing network, or a CTN. That's just the collection of the individual mainframes. They're synchronized to a time called coordinated server time, so that this parallel sysplex, or the cluster, has a single view of time with an external time reference. We use a message-based time synchronization protocol that is very similar to how NTP works. Okay. The timekeeping information for STP is transmitted between the mainframes that are clustered together over specialized connections that we call coupling links. We also have the capability through these coupling links to support a multi-site timing network of up to 200 kilometers distance between the two sites that are connected and synchronized together. Prior to our May 2020 announcement, we had the option for 2 external time sources to provide the external time reference for STP. That was NTP or NTP with pulse per second. And you can see the accuracy numbers that we can guarantee to UTC for both of those references there. The STP will maintain all of the systems in the CTN so that their timestamps stay within less than 10 microseconds of each other. But as far as NTP was concerned, you can see those accuracy limits there. So if you remember from our prior slides on those synchronization requirements, you may or may not be able to stay within those new regulations just by relying on NTP alone without the pulse per second. Next slide, please. So those issues with NTP and the accuracy is what led us to starting to look at PTP as an option for an external time reference for the IBM mainframe. I think all of you are familiar with PTP. It's a very highly precise protocol. The timestamps, the transmission times are measured with hardware timestamping. Switches and devices in the network can all participate in the PTP network. We've seen a variety of tests, but you can get synchronization into the sub-microsecond range with PTP, due in large part to the hardware timestamping. And to date, PTP has been primarily used in the telecom and utility industry, but we are starting to see it moving into finance and banking, due in large part to these new regulations. This led us with IBM Z to move forward, and we have now integrated PTP into the IBM STP environment, providing another option as an external time reference to go along with NTP. And we expect this to see better synchronization for STP, for that synchronization between the individual mainframes. We'll definitely see better synchronization to UTC as well as to non-IBM Z equipment. And we think it's going to provide better resiliency of our STP coordinated timing network. Next slide, please. Okay. So we've had some recent announcements with the IBM mainframe. The latest mainframe is the Z15, and this was announced back in September. And these links in the slides are hot, so they will take you to those announcement letters if you want to read some more. But we announced the Z15, and at that time we announced our statement of direction for supporting precision time protocol on the IBM mainframe. And again, the regulatory changes were the primary driver, coupled with clients asking for us to support PTP. Just last month, our latest announcement came out where we announced the general availability for support of PTP on the Z15. The initial implementation is for PTP connectivity via what we call the Hardware Management Console on the Z15. What this gives us is no change to how STP coordinated timing networks work for our customers today, other than giving them the potential to use PTP as their external time reference instead of relying on NTP. So it gives them another option, and we think that's going to help them comply with the regulations better. Next slide, please. And then our statement of general direction, which we published as part of this announcement series. Future implementation is going to include full connectivity of PTP or an external PTP time source directly to the IBM Z itself. And what this means is we'll be bringing PTP directly in from a time server, whether that's a Mindberg, a microchip, microsemi, whatever that may be. We're going to reintroduce what we call the concept of a mixed coordinated timing network. We're still going to be supporting traditional STP, but we'll also be at the same time supporting a native PTP implementation on IBM Z. And our goal is to enhance the capabilities of the IBM mainframe for our clients that they're going to operate in a PTP environment, to get away from the proprietary STP protocol at some point, and to help our customers comply with the regulations and their security concerns for timing. Next slide, please. Okay. So the last two slides I have, we'll just talk briefly on what some of our thoughts are on improving time synchronization network resiliency. We're involved in the standards committees. That's a pretty hot topic in the standards committees. We're also involved in the DHS conformance working group that has been formed. But from our perspective, when we're talking about resiliency, it's there's a triad of things that you need to talk about, and that's high availability, redundancy, and then security. We've heard some things about GPS today, and I agree very strongly with that. But GPS or satellites in general is not just about positioning it anymore. It's really about time. We think you also really need to look at having a backup plan, not only relying on the GPS satellite system for providing time, but you need to have alternatives and look at, what am I going to do if there is an issue with satellites? There's a whole variety of scenarios, from spoofing, jamming, to if there's a military conflict, what's going to happen with the use of GPS. We need to examine the network security vulnerabilities that exist in all networks. That could be due to poor network design, poor habits when it comes to passwords, those sorts of things, or even protocol vulnerabilities. And we've seen some of those publicized and well-documented issues that NTP has had in recent years. But the good news is, as far as NTP, the IETF has been addressing that, and there is a new network time security draft RFC that has been worked on and is in the approval stages. The other question is, do financial institutions or banks need a dedicated network for time synchronization to address those resiliency and security issues? Next slide, please. Okay. As far as the topic of encryption, time synchronization information is not really a secret. So does it need to be encrypted? Probably not. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is some end users, especially in the financial world, require encryption on all of their networks. So that's something that has to be considered. We think that a robust authentication really needs to be used, and the PTP, the latest version of the standard, the 2019, also known as version 2.1, that security annex should really not be considered optional. You really need to take a good look at those recommendations that are in there and implement those, especially one of the authentication mechanisms, whether that's Tesla or GDOI. There's always the question about accuracy and performance when it comes to resiliency and security. Accuracy is very important to comply with the regulations, but it's really not the be-all, end-all. The standards need to incorporate resiliency and security. The argument that it's going to hurt performance may be valid, but not valid enough to exclude security. And the last point I'd like to make before I wrap up, if you don't have enough resiliency and something bad happens, is somebody going to care about what kind of performance you used to have before the incident happened? Next slide. That's the summary of what I talked about today. Go to the next slide. I'd just like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present, and look forward to hearing any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Now it's time for questions. These questions will be from Tommy's presentation all the way through Steve's. So we'll start with the first one for Gerardo. On slide 92, you talked about the uptake of 1588 profile. Is that for connecting stations or within a campus of stations?
So what we see is we're trying to evaluate both. So it depends where you are and what is the infrastructure that you're trying to look at. There are some substations that are separated by, let's say, a significant amount of time distance. So right now they have fiber. So they're trying to understand how to incorporate the technology, I guess, into both scenarios in a substation and, let's say, between let's say, sites.
Thank you. One more question for you, Gerardo. When you said bumping the wire, could you give us a little more, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so there's products that are coming up in the market that their selling point is you don't have to change the clock to increase the resilience on it against spoofing and jamming. The only thing that you have to do is to disconnect the antenna and put a box in between the antenna and your current clock. So that's what I mean by bumping the wire. It means instead of replacing the whole box, you put something in between your current antenna and your box. So we see some of the vendors providing those type of solutions, and we're evaluating those products.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, question for you. You mentioned that spoofing is not such a big problem. I mean, jamming is not, but spoofing probably is. How do you recommend managing that? And also part of the question is, are you guys participating in the Clear Sky event from DHS?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the reason why I made the comment about jamming versus spoofing is that when you jam the receiver, all the clocks know how to deal with that. So if they lose satellite synchronization, they flag an error. And so the IEEE standard for synchrophasers is IEEE C37118. And so that data flag is set when there's a loss of synchronization event. And so the clock will try to maintain time based on its internal clock, and but it's going to flag that it's lost synchronization. So then the application can be programmed to respond accordingly based on that, the way that that bit flag is set. So
Okay.
that's why, you know, jamming is less of a concern. When you spoof, a successful spoofing attack, the receiver and the clock and everything doesn't know that it's under attack, and it's drifting off actual time. And so then that station is drifting off real time. And as it's measuring the synchrophaser and assigning the phase angle value and reporting that message to the network and the application that's receiving all the data from the different substations, it's impossible to tell the difference between drifting of time and drifting of phase angle. So it's going to report that as a phase angle measurement that's wrong, but nobody knows that it's wrong. And so then incorrect action is going to be taken. So unless you have some other way of detecting that you're being spoofed, that's a much more serious problem, because you're going to take action on a measurement without any flags indicating that the measurement data itself is bad. As it relates to the DHS testing activities, there is an interagency group that's set up. So I primarily support I have had DHS projects in the past, but I primarily support the U.S. Department of Energy. DOE is a sector-specific agency for the electric power sector. So in an interagency federal government role there, DOE participates with DHS, and so my client at DOE is involved in those activities at DHS. And so there is, and they are specifically reaching out to different infrastructure, critical infrastructure sectors that includes the electric power. And there is a great deal of interest in testing different mitigation technologies and alternatives and backups and that sort of thing. And so, so yeah, we are. I'm not personally directly involved in that, but DOE is, and so I am through that connection.
Okay, thank you. Gerardo, a question for you. Is security for substation timing about ensuring the availability and accuracy of the clocks, or does it also involve encryption?
Well, I guess it is kind of hard to add encryption to an unencrypted signal to begin with, and that's where we are right now. So I think what we're looking at right now is to be able to identify and detect that there's an event that is potentially negatively impacting the performance of these systems. It could be not only an antenna, let's say an RF attack, but it could be also a network attack. So on the network side, let's say you can have behavior changes that could mess up with the timing of timing on that network. So I would say we're not focusing too much on encryption, but we're looking at what are the different mechanisms that you can add to an application that currently does not have encryption that could make it more resilient. and that will be a whole host of solutions that will make it more resilient to these type of anomalies. And in the cybersecurity realm, they call that defense in depth. So you will perhaps add an antenna, add a network anomaly detection. A simple question is, are you looking at the alerts coming out of GPS receivers? And some of the answers that I've heard is yes, and some of the answers is no. So okay, that's all you want to start looking at. So it's a more comprehensive look at how these applications are designed, how do they respond to these events, and how can you better architect them in the future.
Okay, thank you. Well, that brings us to the 12 o'clock hour, so we're going to close for now. I want everyone to know that the questions will be sent out to the speakers, and they will have the opportunity to respond to the questioners. Remember that next Wednesday, we have a timing, security, resilience, and GNSS resilience session. March of next year in Denver is the face-to-face vWSTS. We hope you can all attend. Today has been an absolute pleasure, and I want to thank you all for your participation. Conference is closed.